There's a tale of an African king who had a childhood companion that would go on to serve him in his leadership. One of the king's hobbies was hunting. And one day the king and this companion of his, who was his servant, they were out on a hunt. And on this expedition, as part of the responsibility, the king's companion would load the king's gun in preparation for him firing at the wild game. As they came upon some wild game, the companion did so. He loaded the gun and he handed it off to the king. The king got ready and took aim. And as he pulled the trigger back, and as the hammer sprung forward, it misfired, blowing off his thumb. This childhood companion, who would become the king's servant, was known for his optimism. In every situation, whether good or bad, he was known for saying, "This is good." As the king had fired this rifle, the shot inerrant, taking off of his thumb entirely, the king looked with absolute horror at the missing appendage from his hand, and he looked over at the individual, his childhood best friend, the servant of the king, looking for an explanation, and what he was met with was, "This is good." The king demanded an answer from his companion and servant. "How could you say such a thing?" And in absolute anger, as they arrived back at the palace, he had his best friend imprisoned. A year later, the king was going out on another hunting expedition, this time by himself. And as he was out, he wandered off into an area that was known for tribes that were cannibals. As the king was out hunting, looking for this wild game, he was quickly surrounded from all sides by an indigenous tribe of cannibals. They apprehended him, they tied him up, they strung him through a pole, and they began to hang his body from one rafter to the next. The only thing that would span that gap was the fire that would be lit beneath him. They began to collect firewood, and as they started to place the firewood underneath the king, getting ready to light this fire so they could have a good old-fashioned cookout, one of the tribesmen noticed, as the king's arms were crossed and tied together through this pole, that the king was missing a thumb. A very superstitious people, they did not believe that it would bring them luck if they were to eat an individual that was in any way unwhole. Missing a thumb, they determined that this man was considered unwhole, so they took him down from the spit, they untied him, and they sent him on his way. On his way from being held captive and nearly cooked back to the castle, he had time to reflect on his reaction to his best friend and servant. And at that moment, he felt like he had overreacted. And so he went to the dungeon and he found his friend who had been held captive for the better part of a year. And he began to lament with remorse in his heart and a quiver in his voice. And he said, I'm so sorry for what I did to you." And the king's friend looked on with not an ounce of revenge in his voice, and he said with absolute assurance, "This is good." And the king at this point was completely confused by this man's response, and he demanded another answer. "How could this be good? I had you imprisoned. I've had you locked away in a dungeon where you have been held captive for a year. You haven't seen daylight. How can you say that this is good?" And the king's friend said with absolute assurance and joy in his heart, "Because, my king, had I been with you on the expedition, I wouldn't be here right now." What a paradox. You look at a situation like the one of the tale of the African king, And while you have in your mind one thing, it actually is something entirely different. While most of us would look at the surrounding circumstances of this man's life, being held captive for over a year, and all the tragedies associated with the separation of your family, of your income, of any community outside of the cell, you would see that as a horrible thing. This man was able to look on with a paradoxed approach and say, this is good. Because he had a greater context. He saw a bigger picture. He knew that there was more to the story. You know, coming in tonight, as a staff and as leaders and volunteers, we were lamenting how we could call something like Jesus' crucifixion good. That we would aptly name a night of celebration like this Good Friday. My friend Jennifer, as she read from John 18 and John 19, the trial that began at Caiaphas' house and ended a third time trial in Pilate's presence, who would then be turned over not to the Jews but to the Romans, who would then be crucified, who would experience the most unimaginable pain, torment, suffering that you could imagine, is something that we would affectionately know today as Good Friday. I would argue that none of us would look at the circumstances surrounding Jesus' life and would tie the word good to it. And if we were to put ourselves in Jesus' place, which I don't know that any of us would, and I certainly know none of us could, we would consider that to be a good thing. But Jesus, as he sat nailed to this cross, arms spread wide, feet secured, he was able to say in 3 simple words, it is finished. In order for us to understand the paradox of how Jesus' death and the destruction of humanity in that moment is a good thing, we have to understand what Jesus was really saying. In order for us to understand what Jesus was really saying, I think about what John records in his gospel, where he says that above Jesus' head hung a sign in 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, that said, "Here is Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews." He made sure that it was in every language that the surrounding communities could read and understand. And so language is important. Well, I think in order for us to understand the paradox of something like a tragic death like Jesus would die being something that we can call good and celebrate, we need to understand the language behind it. The word that we see in verse 28 of John 19, and then we'll see again in verse 30, when he says, it is finished, is the word tetelestai. Tetelestai. In the Greek, it comes from teteleo, which is a verb. It's an action. It's something that has taken place. The etymology of that word is, in the tense of how it's used, is what's called the perfect tense. The reason it's called the perfect tense is because it's applied in 3 different factions. The perfect tense suggests that something has happened, is happening, and will happen. In other words, it's complete, it's perfect, it's entire. So when Jesus says, it is finished, tetelestai, what Jesus is saying word for word, verbatim, is what was and is and will be is complete. It is entire. It is finished. It has been accomplished. If you were to look at some things that are synonymous, some examples that would help us understand even more what Jesus' 3 simple words represent. One wouldn't have to look much further than Mount Kilimanjaro. Before you would go and set out to scale Mount Kilimanjaro, the highest mountain in Africa, one of the highest mountains in the world, one would have to commit in their minds to be dedicated and to persevere to the process. And there's work that would be done leading up to that. And when you reach the summit, the peak, the zenith of the mountain, and you stake your claim, the word that could be used there is tetelestai. It is finished. I planned before I took off. I've made the journey, and now I'm going to make the descent, and no one can ever take away from me what I just accomplished. How about another example? How many of you graduated college with some debt. Many of you, I would argue, have graduated college with some debt or have had a car payment or a mortgage payment or a medical payment of some sort. You've had a payment of some sort. And you put together a payment plan, whether it's with your lender or you get a credit card and however you've established it, and it's got an interest rate associated with it, and it's got a timetable associated with it that it's going to take to pay off this loan. And when it comes time to pay that last payment, it's finished. There's nothing else to pay. You've done what's necessary. You considered the cost before you bought what it is you were trying to purchase, and it's done. Ladies, those of you moms in here, let this one resonate with you. How many of you, after 9 months of heaven and giving birth to that beautiful baby of yours, you looked on with an affection that you did not know was possible at this child of yours? And you knew in that moment that the birthing process was finished, but that this life together had just begun. It was finished. I think about a race. I've never run a marathon for good reason. No one's chased me. And certainly not for over 20 miles. At that point, I would turn around and I'd just fight them. We're not running that far. Take my chances. But if you've ever run a marathon or an ultra marathon and you get past that 26 plus mile mark, you can look at the finish line. And as you cross that finish line, you can know that all the preparation and hard work that you put into that, all the energy and effort that went into running that race, that as you broke that ribbon and you received that medal with a time that was associated with the work you put in, that it was finished. Those are 4 examples that are synonymous with the word that Jesus uses, tetelestai. Broken down in its perfect tense in the most understandable manner, the word tetelestai, it is finished, is literally the word victory. I want you to hear that. The etymology of that word literally is a victorious word. We look at Good Friday at what Jesus endured, at the pain and the suffering, everything from the time that Jesus was betrayed to the time that Jesus was arrested, to the time that Jesus was separated, to the time that Jesus was beaten, where he was spit upon, where he was blindfolded, he was mocked, he was beaten, he was stripped, he was scourged, and then ultimately, through 3 trials, he was turned over to Romans, where he would experience the death penalty that was set aside for the most egregious of criminals. And we say that that is horrible, that is horrific, and you're right, humanly speaking, that is horrible and horrific, but that is so short-sighted, because Jesus, even as he hung on the cross and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," his 3 simple words in the end were words of victory. It is finished. You see, Jesus knew from Genesis 3, from the inception where sin entered the world and the fall of man began, that there would come a time where a price had to be paid for a sacrifice that would be paid once and for all who would believe. And Jesus knew when he came, when he entered earth through the form of a virgin, being born in a miraculous manner, dying in a miraculous manner, what was going to happen. He had prepared for it. He lived for it, even up into the point of the garden before his arrest. Jesus says, "Father, I wish there was another way. I don't want to do this, God. It's too heavy for me to carry." And capillaries started to break open on his body, and he began to sweat blood. And yet Jesus said in that moment, "Even still, Lord, not my will, but yours be done." Jesus was counting the cost. Jesus knew what was in front of him. Pilate, when he said, "Look, if you're a king, put a stop to this." And Jesus says, "Oh, you don't understand. You only have power because my Father in heaven has given it to you. I could call down a legion of angels and put a stop to this right now. But I knew what I was up for. I know what was set out before me." And when he says tetelestai, it is finished. It is perfect tense. It was, it is, and it will be. Jesus hung on that cross and he cried, "Victory! Victory!" We look at death as darkness. Jesus looks at death as victory. Why? Because Jesus knew that that wasn't the final chapter. Jesus knows that that isn't the final chapter. Jesus knows that 3 days later, there's going to be a great miracle that follows. Perfect tense, was, is, and will be. Jesus is going to conquer death, tetelestai, victory, so that we could conquer death in our confession, in our profession, in our dedication and commitment to Christ. Friends, for 25 years, as a minister of the gospel, I have viewed Good Friday with somber attitude and heavy heart. And there's nothing wrong with that. To lament what Jesus did, and here's the truth of it, friends. I believe with all of my heart that if you were the only existence when Jesus hung on that cross, he would have died for you. Right. And so it's appropriate for me to lament and reflect that what Jesus did, he did for me. And in his sovereignty and in his omnisciency, he did for each one of you. It's appropriate for you to lament. I would argue it would be inappropriate for you to come haphazardly, not understanding that the gravity of your sin, the egregiousness of your behavior, your brokenness, your folly, didn't come at a cost. Paul told the church in Rome, we've all sinned. We've all fallen short of God's glorious standard. Paul would go on again to tell the church in Rome, the wages of sin is death. But the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. The paradox of a day like today where we look at the sacrifice of Jesus and we can say it is good is because of tetelestai, because of the victory where Jesus stamped out the penalty of death and darkness. It's appropriate for us to lament. It's good. Before I came in here tonight, I was sitting with my own thoughts. And I was doing my own devotion. I don't know how many of you have read the Bible in a year, or how many of you have ever done an inductive study in the book of Leviticus. Most people who commit to doing a year-long study through the Bible give up about Leviticus 2 or 3. But if you give yourself some time, I was in Leviticus 7 and Leviticus 8 today. Leviticus 7 and Leviticus 8 are the priestly sacrifices. It's what God sets aside for Aaron and the priests and the Levites, that before they can lead the nation of Israel in offering sacrifices to God and in worship, they themselves have to be clean. There's a purification process. They would have to go and bring a spotless sacrifice. And if they didn't have one, they would have to buy one. And they would then have to prepare it with flour and with oil that would be burnt entirely. Literally, it would be reduced to ash. And the Bible says that God receives that like a sweet aroma rising before him. The priests would have to prepare their hearts. They would have to be made right before God in whole sacrifice. And David understood this. David said, look, sacrifice is necessary, but it's not the kind of sacrifice that requires something of us, because gold and silver you don't want. If you wanted that, I've got it all. I've got it in spades. But what you want is a contrite heart and a broken spirit. You want a renewed spirit. And he asked God, create in me a clean heart and renew a right spirit in me. David says, search me, test me, try me. Know these things in me. And I would say that as we come into Good Friday, that is what we need to do. We need to prepare our hearts. We need to ask God to search us, test us, try us, reveal anything in us, and allow it to come to the surface. Allow it to be brought to our minds, those sins of commission and those sins of omission. And then as we reflect on what Jesus did, what Jesus does, and what Jesus will do, we can bring confession to God and saying, Lord, for all that I've done, known or unknown, if I've sinned against you or if I've sinned against others, please forgive me, and thank you that you paid the penalty tetelestai, the victory over the egregiousness of my sin and death. Yeah. We can look at all that Jesus experienced on what we have termed Good Friday as a paradox, because we understand the nature of what Jesus says. I want to read this again in our time together tonight. In verse 28 of chapter 19, Jesus knew Jesus knew that his mission was now finished. You see, he had set out, he had run the race, and now he had completed it. It was finished. And to fulfill the scriptures, he said, I'm thirsty. A jar of sour wine was sitting there. So they soaked a sponge in it. They put it on a hyssop branch, and they held it up to his lips. When Jesus had tasted it, he said, it is finished. And then he bowed his head. And I want you to pay really close attention to this. He bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. It wasn't taken from him. He willfully, knowingly, lovingly, and victoriously gave up his spirit so that we could experience in perfect tense a victory in Jesus that we could never experience apart from him. Tetelestai. Victory. It is finished. It is complete. It is entire. There is nothing left to do. Jesus has done it all. And because it's perfect tense, Jesus did it. Jesus is doing it. And Jesus will continue to do it. My friends, we have not only an opportunity, but a responsibility tonight to reflect on those three simple words. It is finished. And not mourn Jesus' death, but celebrate the victory. Celebrate the victory. Celebrate the victory. We have much cause and reason to celebrate. Let our celebration begin with a contrite spirit and asking God to renew our hearts, giving thanks to him that he did once and for all who would believe. The worship team's going to come up right now. And as we think about what Jesus did as being good, we're going to have an opportunity to intentionally reflect on and remember Jesus. Caden, would you move this to the back, please? Thank you.